Afternoon to everyone who's come to the South African Chamber's webinar series today to hear again economics from another perspective. South African Chamber is based in the UK. We are here to help business, investment, and to support businesses going between the two countries and to support our whole South African community in a global environment, the UK, and also those that are within the South African environment. What I would like to just cover now quickly is I'm South African Chairman. Sorry, let me just start with that part as well. We had an economic view from the Governor of the Reserve Bank recently, and today we're going to be covering an economic view of South Africa's possibilities and opportunities given the post-COVID environment. It'll be a very different perspective, I'm sure, to that we have had from the Governor of the Reserve Bank. So I'm looking forward to hearing it from that of a practitioner in a different point of view. The chat line is not open, but the Q&A as part of the webinar is open. So please pose your questions. We will be having questions of at least 15 minutes at the end. We will finish on time. We're here to bring you value, so please ask your questions so that we can answer them. It's often a very interesting part. I hear these gentlemen are extremely interesting to listen to. You're not here to listen to me, so I would like to bring my little part to the end and hand over to historian Dr. Dean Allen. Dean has previously given presentations to the Chamber before, at the time of the launch of his very well-known book to most of us, Empire, War and Cricket, where he's looked at history and he's looked at the sport of cricket as well and how those two have correlated in Africa. At the moment, he's a Brit in South Africa. I think he's more South African than some of us that are here in the UK as South Africans. He's holed up in a B&B in the Garden Route in lockdown. We all locked down in various places. It's one of the more unusual ones. What Dean is going to be doing for us today is looking at lessons of previous recessions and depressions in history and how we have recovered from them and what lessons we can learn for how we are going to come out of this current crisis. I wouldn't call it a recession or depression because we don't quite know what it's going to be. So at this point, no further ado, I'd like to hand over to you. All the best, Dean. Take it away.
Thank you, Sharon. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dean Allen, as Sharon said, and it's an absolute pleasure to be back here with you again. It was a number of years ago that I spoke to the Chamber back there in London. I was presenting stories from my book. Those of you in the audience who know South Africa well will have heard of a place called Fontein. Well, I'm quite famous here in South Africa for being the author of the book about Fontein. But today I'm going to be talking about something different. I'm going to be looking at lessons from history. I'm a historian, you see, and I've joined together with my colleague here, Andre du Toit. Andre is a political commentator and an economist. And we'll be looking at, my job is to look at lessons from history. Andre will be looking at the current situation. So I think it's a perfect combination. We've given this talk now a number of times, and and people have got good things from it in terms of information going forward, and I believe we can take positive lessons from history. So if we could start off now, I'm actually, as Sharon said, I'm actually based in South Africa now, despite this West Country accent. But I'm in the Garden Route in a place called Wilderness. I'm sure some of you would have known that. It's a beautiful part of the country. It's quite a chilly day here today, but I've got somebody back in Cape Town controlling my slides. So we could start the presentation, please, Terry. Thank you very much. As I said, I've decided to call my part of the talk Lessons from History. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing today. So if we can move on to the first slide, I'm going to be looking at economic recessions through history. I think it's important that we look back to the past to give us a guide of where we are today and where we're going forward. Now, as Sharon rightly said, we don't really know how the current COVID or coronavirus situation is going to affect our economy. We do know that, of course, it's having a detrimental effect as we speak. I'm going to be looking at the various patterns that I've seen through history. I'm going to be looking at the Great Depression, what happened after the First World War, and then I'm going to look how the world recovered after the Second World War. I'm going to bring it forward in the limited time I've got today by looking at 2008, 2009. That was a modern economic crisis. It was called the Great Recession. And then I want to end with good news in terms of opportunities and hopefully recovery, because we will come through this. Now, let's just put this into perspective. I've got a quote here from Peter Cohen of Forbes. And I'm sure you'll agree, the one thing that he has got right here is the uncertainty. We do not know what kind of damage the current COVID-19 crisis will be doing to the economy and stock prices in terms of where we are now and in the future. I mean, that will become clear. But for me as a historian, it's important that we look at the past, but perhaps to look at some patterns. And that's what I'm going to do now. In fact, I'm going to take you right back until the 1700s, would you believe? I mean, in fact, that we had a credit crisis then, and that originated in London, where many of you are based now listening to this talk, and it spread to Europe and the colonies. And it was caused by a credit expansion of British banks back there, and a character called Alexander Fordyce, who was a key banker, fleeing to France, and that precipitated this panic. Many believe that actually led to the American Revolution. We recovered from that, as we did recover from the Great Depression. And I'll look at that in more detail. That occurred in the 1920s, well, the late 1920s and throughout the 30s. And in fact, to date, is the worst financial and economic disaster of the 20th century. That was triggered, as I'll explain, by the Wall Street crash, and it led to, at its peak, 25% unemployment in America, which is quite incredible. Now, I've heard people claim, and Andre will talk about that in his part of the presentation, that potentially we could be facing a depression or a recession as bad as that, caused by today's situation. We'll wait and see to see how that pans out. Looking at the 1970s, I had to refer to the OPEC oil price shock. You probably remember that. That was when the OPEC countries declared an embargo against the United States. Again, it was very political. And that coincided with high inflation and economic stagnation. They called it stagflation, as the economists termed it at the time. Fast forward to the 1990s, we saw the Asian crisis, which started in Thailand. It was triggered by the Asian tiger impact of excessive credit and debt, which led, as many of you know, to panic in world markets. The International Monetary Fund intervened, and it led to years of recovery from that particular crisis. I'm also going to look today at only 10 years ago, when we had the Great Recession of 2007-2008. That was triggered by a housing crisis and the collapse of the Lehman Brothers Bank, as you probably remember. And also government bailouts were recovered. That took a 10-year recovery to get over that. But talking about history, we need to have a context in which these things took place. Now, the Great Recession of depression, should I say, of the 1920s was directly as a result of World War I, and we'll talk about that now in more detail. Now, you've heard of the Great War, of course. 9 million troops perished in the war. 21 million soldiers died, not to mention the malnutrition, the incredible refugees, I mean, the effect it had on the world. Well, of course, that would affect the economy, and that's what we're going to look at now. And in terms of South Africa, how did that particular event affect South Africa? Many of us, of course, have South African interests in the room. Well, before World War I, we had the Union of South Africa, and that was very much dependent on the British Empire. Now, the World War I, as many historians have claimed, was the end of the British Empire. It certainly precipitated the end of much of the colonial rule. Well, we look at South Africa's involvement in World War I. I mean, there were 230,000 troops sent to fight on behalf of the king there, and 146,000 were white. The reason why I've said that is because that part of the population made up most of South Africa's workforce in terms of production, in terms of manufacturing. So as a result of World War I, you had an immediate shortage of imported goods, rising inflation, and of course the departure of much of the workforce for the war effort. And a talk I've been giving recently, and you probably heard about it, is the impact of the Spanish flu. Well, that actually, it was like a double whammy. The Spanish flu, to date, is the world's worst natural disaster. It infected over a quarter of the world's population. Over 100 million people died as a result of the Spanish flu. And here in South Africa, they were particularly badly hit. In fact, they were the 5th worst hit country in the world. 600,000 people perished as a result of the Spanish flu. So those kind of effects, the World War I and the Spanish flu, are going to affect any economy, of course. But we saw that eventually the seeds of recovery did occur here in South Africa. For example, the growth of South Africa's small manufacturing sector. And also we could see increased urbanization. There was expansion in urban areas, and even electrification led to increased opportunities within industry. We also saw that there were new opportunities for non-white workers. So the workforce was expanding. So we could go on to the next slide, please. This, I've got a short video here of the Great Depression of 1929, and that's what we're going to lead into now. So if you could just play that video, Terry.
1929. The financial house of cards collapses, and the overinflated stock market plunges into a Great Depression. A financial panic grips the world. For the majority, it means the interminable line outside factory gates, desperately hoping for a job that rarely comes. It means hunger and the march of the unemployed in the nation's capital. With acute domestic problems, America would now isolate herself more than ever from the international scene. It started in America, but practically overnight an economic blizzard swept the world. In Japan, France, Britain, always the unemployed, the soup kitchens, the grinding poverty, and the despair.
Now you can see from that video, of course, that the Great Depression is still etched on the psyche of many Americans, certainly, because that's where it hit hardest, but it spread throughout the world. If we just look at the era of that times in terms of economy, before the First World War, the global economy was flourishing, but of course the war had an effect. And after the First World War, you had restricted trade, you had rising inflation, there were war debts, and someone like Germany, of course, was crippled as a result of World War I. So therefore, the world was facing a shortage of supplies. The manufacturing sectors in much of the Western countries was restricted. You had a scarcity of a skilled workforce, and there was rationing of food. I mean, these incredible images you can see today have been made famous. So in 1929, it led to a massive depression. But where did it actually come from? Well, it came from a stock market crash. In fact, the US banks were seeking war loan repayments in late as the 1920s from Europe. Therefore, they put a high tariffs on European goods. It led to this global breakdown in terms of economic markets. In fact, between 1929 and 1932, the global GDP fell by 15%, which is quite remarkable. Just to give you an comparison to 2008, 2009, the GDP of the global market fell by 5%. In fact, in 1929 to 1932, 25% of the world's workforce were unemployed, which is quite incredible. Now, we could just look at the next images here. You can see that, as I said, there's a lot of social impacts here. I mean, queues at soup kitchens, incredible image. You've probably seen this on the right, a lady forced to sell her children. Fortunately, should I say, that didn't take place. Books have been written about those 4 individuals, by the way. But you can see from the next image here, it was all about the stock market, people rushing to the banks to get their money out before the banks collapsed. We can move to the next slide, please, Terry. Here we see it. So the Great Depression was fundamental in really how the world was being seen at that time. If we come to South Africa, though, it was also being affected. The next slide will show us here that in South Africa, it was particularly hard hit in terms of agriculture and mineral exports, of course, important industries in South Africa. We can see between 1925 and 1933, for example, the South African wool price fell by 75%. That won't surprise you to hear that there were many farm repossessions during that time. South Africa was saved then, like it had done time and time again, by the gold mining industry. In fact, gold prices actually rose during that time and exports grew. So South Africa, as we know, gold has such an important part of our history that it affected the economy in a positive way there. So it was saved, the recession or the effect of the 1929 depression actually saved South Africa from complete collapse. Eventually, the government stepped in. Taxes on import raised income and encouraged domestic production. And we'll see that as a pattern. Whenever there's a recession, government intervention kicks in. In fact, Jan Smut's mock budget of 1933 boosted market confidence. He explained to the economic sector how this was going to be managed. And I think that clarity of information and that clear leadership gave the South African market a clear way forward. But how did the world come out of the 1929 Great Depression? Well, it was due to this man, Franklin D. Roosevelt. It was called the New Deal, and it was all about economic recovery in the 1930s. FDR reformed Wall Street. He gave relief for farmers and the unemployed. and the unemployed, and in fact offered state employment. So again, it was the government that was coming back in and bailing out the private economy. The Social Security Program, Housing Act, workers' rights were introduced during this time. The kind of models that we see today around the world. In fact, it led to a political power shift to what we call a democratic New Deal coalition. And if we look at the amounts that Roosevelt's government put into this effort, $500 million US, which is equivalent to $10 billion US today, for state relief programs and bank bailouts. And in fact, they changed the laws at that time to protect against future stock market activity, so that the stock market could not dictate world economies as strongly as it had done up to that point. So the 1930s were a period of rebuilding. But what happened next? Well, the Second World War, as we can see here. So Adolf Hitler and his ideas of expansion over there in Europe was going to affect the world economy again. Thankfully, the war did come to an end in 1945, but how did it affect South Africa? Again, here in South Africa, we were part of that war effort. 334,000 troops were sent to fight on the side of the Allies. You can see there the great majority were white South Africans, 11,000 deaths. But what happened next was quite interesting, because recovery was a lot quicker, not just here in South Africa, but around the world. You see, people had learned the lessons from the First World War. I mean, here we have a wonderful scene. I think it's Jeppe Street in Johannesburg, if you know that particular city. If we look at the recovery, it was due again to the gold mining industry. In fact, 2/3 of South Africa's revenue and 3/4 of its export earnings were due to gold at that time. There was a growth in the South African manufacturing sector during the late 1940s and early 50s. In fact, employment was up by 60%. We can see that Africans were now employed for the first time in certain manufacturing sectors. The workforce was now being utilized. So this led to a rapid increase in urbanization, a change of social living, change of social structures. Cities grew, and as we know, townships as well. But if we look at the global picture, it was all to do with this post-World War II global recovery, because the lessons were learned from World War I. In fact, the Marshall Plan of 1947 was key. And again, it was politically driven. The US supported war-torn countries, including Germany, would you believe, as part of this rebuilding effort, because it was all to do with repelling Russian influence. So it was no good having a weak Germany. It was better to build that country up. And that's what the Marshall Plan did. So by 1947, we could see that industrial production was actually at pre-war levels, which is quite remarkable. It was called the Age of Economic Growth. And in fact, if we look at, I'm interested in tourism, by the way. I've given this presentation to groups of people in the tourism industry who are particularly hard hit at the moment, of course. But if we look at the 1950s, this is where tourism really began, mass tourism, because people had leisure time, disposable income, package holidays, theme parks, etc. And in fact, if we look there, early retirement, larger incomes, and an aging population led to what we now know as as a boost in tourism. So that's where we've recovered from the First and Second World War. Now, what about a more recent crisis? Now, we can see here the modern economic crisis, or the Great Recession, occurred only a decade ago. And that is, in fact, the world's most severe since 1929. And it was all to do with a housing crisis, that the banks were lending too much in terms of mortgages for people and not getting those repayments back. And it led to another banking collapse. Well, President Obama there in America intervened, and with government bailouts supported the affected economies. It led to another stimulus package over a 10-year period, including tax incentives, which was called the Economic Stimulus Act. In fact, Obama's stimulus package was actually valued at $800 billion alone in tax cuts. So you can see, again, with a recession, it may have been occurred in the private sector, but it was due to the government coming in and bailing out that particular part of the industry. South Africa was also particularly affected. We know the challenges we have in our economy here in South Africa. People in the room will know that. But do you remember 10 years ago, it was particularly hard hit? And we can see that from the next slide. How was South Africa affected by the Great Recession? Well, there was an economic crisis. For once, the mining revenue was falling. We had rising inflation and increased interest rates at that time. It was all about unemployment. At one point, we had unemployment as high as 40% here. 1 million jobs were lost over an 18-month period. There was a 33% decline in the mining sector. We couldn't rely on the mining sector at that time. There was a 22% decline in manufacturing. In fact, South African exports were down by 24%. Company failures were up by 47%. Again, the government stepped in. It bailed out companies to the tune of 500 million rand. And in fact, it set aside as much as 3 billion rand for economic aid and public work programs. We look back now, and what actually happened, the Reserve Bank reduced interest rates to attract investors and short-term capital inflows. And that's what we can see. So eventually, even here in South Africa, we were able to come out of that Great Recession, as it was known. But this is a presentation between myself and Andre today with a positive note. And I want to just show you this screen. You may have seen this before, but these are 10 successful startup companies that were founded during the Great Recession of 2008. And we all recognize those logos, don't we? I mean, things like Uber, WhatsApp, Instagram. Yes, they're very much based on e-commerce and social media, but these are well established, and let's face it, multi-billion-dollar industries that were established back in 2008. So to wrap up my part of the presentation, I just want to sum up what we've covered today. Well, both World War I and World War II caused economic recessions. That's clear. I mean, wars take money and obviously are going to affect all parts of society. In 1929, this led to one of the world's worst depressions. But we did come out of that. And the reason why the global economy recovered was because of state intervention and perhaps strong leadership. You know, the likes of Franklin D. Roosevelt. We've seen more recently, Barack Obama had a plan. Here in South Africa, we're hoping that Cyril Ramaphosa has a similar plan for the economic impact that COVID-19 is going to affect us, of course, here in South Africa, like everybody else. We can see that South Africa's economy is heavily dependent on mining and tourism. That has happened throughout history and will continue to be the case. But I do believe that opportunities do arise from times of economic hardship. And that's when I'm going to pass you over now to my colleague, Andre du Toit. He is known as the big positive guy, but he is someone I admire greatly for having an insight into what is happening today. And I'll pass you over to Andre, who's in chilly Cape Town as we speak. Andre, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dean. For those of you who know Cape Town and stuff, it's a funny thing to say chilly Cape Town, but it genuinely is chilly Cape Town today. It's averaging somewhere between 7 and 14 degrees. We're having one of our big major storms, one of our 6 major storms of the year, so it's been hailing and the wind has been blowing, so it'd be nice. Can somebody just pin me on the screen, or am I pinned on the screen? I can't see there. One of the things that I wanted to say to you is that this is not a normal economics presentation. You've heard Letshego, and I'm sure he's had a completely different view. So my side of things is going to focus around 3 things. Where we are currently, and in the process we need to survive, to see what's actually happening. The second thing I want to do is the effect of fake news that it's had on the South African economy. And the last one I want to do is I just want to cherry pick some opportunities for those of you that are investors or even living in South Africa to show you some of the many opportunities that we potentially have. Next slide. Next one. So who wants this guy's job? You know, you're a multi-billionaire, you're worth a few billion rand. Someone asks you if you want to be president, you go and you have immediate opposition from from your followers. And then the really first big challenge you have is you get given a global pandemic. I think the only person who potentially can say she's had it worse is the New Zealand Prime Minister, who in her first year has had an earthquake, a terrorist attack, and the global pandemic, and has come out smiling on the other side and still surviving. But the reality is that our president has really done exceptionally well in very difficult times. He's starting to get a lot of flack, but he always gets a lot of flack. I think he's in one of those situations that he's going to be cursed if he wins and he's going to be cursed if he loses. It doesn't really matter what he does, but he has taken some decisions which have had very positive effects in our country. Next slide. I was fascinated. This is not the latest figures, but the reason I show this is that exactly 30 days, I gave this presentation to 1,500 people, and I said to them, I am shattered by the fact that over 3 million people globally have had this disease and 225,000 deaths. 30 days ago. We have short memories. Next slide. This is the figure 2 days ago. 7.3 million. The numbers are escalating. And so for many of you that are in the, almost want to call the first world countries, you've been in the Europe, UK, you've gone through a lot of this and it's starting to slow down. But the reality is that it hasn't slowed down globally, and around the world, it's starting to accelerate. Next slide. So this is one of the things that I want to discuss, is that we made a decision in our country to close down almost immediately. We closed the borders, we brought in strict lockdown facilities, and we stayed there for an enormously long time. And as such, we have had almost negligible deaths. And I'm not saying 1,000 deaths is negligible, but the reality is we've had negligible deaths. But we've now opened up, and we've literally only opened up, it was last week, Monday, to go down to level 3, where most of the people went back to work, and it's had an immediate impact. Next slide. One of the things that I have had to do and feel it's my duty is to walk around and say, this is not over. This hasn't stopped. And I know there's a huge economic impact, but we still have to take certain precautions. If you look at the figures here, and the people that are covering themselves in glory are normally the countries where the presidents have taken very, very little central action, or even in the case of Brazil, just basically flat out denying it. I think the UK is in a very good position, where you had 40,000 deaths 2 days ago, and Brazil had 38,000 deaths. I think it's going to rapidly be passed by Brazil. The number of new cases, just look at, this is daily figures, 31,000 new cases in Brazil, 19,000 new cases in the United States. The scary figure, however, is that last week, when our first week of opening it up to level 3, is that South Africa, although we don't even feature on this table until right down the bottom, what happens is that immediately we are having new cases in the order of 2,000 to 3,000 per day. And I wouldn't be surprised to see that escalating, going to 5,000 plus by next week. So you see us right at the bottom here, with around about 2,000 cases a day. Incidentally, that's the 5th fastest growing country in terms of new cases. It's really quite shattering that in the space of a week, when we haven't even really had time to mingle, that we've already shut up right at the top here. But let's just quickly look at some other ones. Let's look at number 14, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan. There are so many countries which haven't been part of these big global figures that are now coming through in terms of massive numbers. And the one I also want to pick out at the bottom right there, number 25, Sweden, which had so much positive publicity. So many economists and business people were telling us, do this, Africans or not. And what happens, we haven't had this thing. But even in countries like Sweden, where they've tried hard, are starting to feel the pain. And so the reality, 5,000 deaths in a country which is theoretically disciplined and doing the things like it. This is still a disease which is going to have massive effects. Next slide. In South Africa, we haven't had the liberty of first world medicine. For those of you who live here or have lived here before, it is a very disparate system where we have a very first world private sector and a very third world government sector. The government has taken the opportunity of the 70 plus days of lockdown to put as many beds in place. What you see here is the Cape Town International Convention Center. And for many of you that have been to demos and to one of these major conventions that we have here, now what you have literally is every 1.5 meters in this entire convention center is a bed fully equipped to deal with all the overflow. And on Saturday, the first people started going to it. This is only the beginnings of the disease in South Africa. The interesting thing for us has been, and I'm trained as a mathematician, is one of the things that we've been very fascinated by, is that our death rate is exceptionally low. And so nobody knows exactly what's going on there, but I suspect that in the next few weeks and months, we're going to find out whether we have some sort of immunity towards it, or whether we've got a very young population which is possibly resisting it and not getting as many sick people as we can. The first point I really want to make is that this disease, it's hard to judge how much it's going to impact South Africa, because we're sitting in a political situation. If too many people die, the government won't survive. And if we leave the lockdown in place for too long, the government won't survive, because the economic fallout will be absolutely massive. Next slide. I want to move on a little bit and just say how we've been affected by negative press and very often a perception of our own abilities. So we were downgraded in February of 2017 to junk status. Last thing you must call as a South African is a junk status. We tend to get all rugby-like and start pushing people around. But the reality was that very few people understood what being junk status would mean to us. So as we went into the lockdown, as the COVID virus hit, the first thing that happened is Moody's downgraded us, which felt a little bit cynical because we were already on our knees. And then the reality is then you downgraded and a lot of foreign capital had to leave the money, had to leave the country. And so what is the effect of that been? And I think this is quite an important 3 slides that I just want to look at. Next slide. When you get downgraded and you get moved into a junk status, there are 3 things that are bound to happen. The one is that your interest rates will rocket. Everyone will tell you that. It's because the cost of capital is so high that your interest rates across the country will necessarily rise. If you look at this slide and you look at around about 2017 first quarter, when we were given the word that we were being downgraded, the reality is that ever since then, our interest rates have dropped. And it's been a nice slow progression until we've recently hit the COVID virus. And obviously in a stimulus package, what the government, the Reserve Bank has been doing is dropping these interest rates. But I also don't think he has much of a choice. It's not just to stimulate that. The reality is that our inflation rate is getting lower and lower. There needs to be some form of correlation. I'm 60 years of age this year. And one of the things I want to say to you is that graph on the left-hand side says that the interest rates are 23% in the year 2000. 23%. We've gone from 23% to the lowest interest rates that we have ever seen in this country. If this doesn't allow for certain economic opportunities, then I don't know what. And the only danger that we don't want the interest rates to go out too low, because then we don't become sexy enough for all the great big nice foreign investors, which we so desperately looking for. Next slide. The next slide for me is an even more fascinating one, because the first thing that you would imagine is that if you've been downgraded, is that you're really, really going to struggle to find money. So again, if I go back into 2017 and go back a little bit there, we were giving bonds around about the 7 to the 8% mark. And the reality is that the cost of capital has not risen astronomically. The only time that it really went up astronomically is when Moody's downgraded us now in conjunction with the COVID virus. And all of a sudden we've rocketed up. But even in those 60 days that have gone past, we've literally dropped again from 12% on a 10-year bond right down to a 9% interest rate. And it is still going down. And not only that, but they've all been oversubscribed. So I want to suggest to you that the cost of capital is not going to be, or the accessibility to capital is not going to be as difficult as what people think that it's going to be. Next slide. And this is my favorite slide because everyone keeps telling me to take my money and post it overseas. So 2017 in April, we get downgraded and the Rand is 14 Rand 70. And everyone says that the Rand will crash and it will never, ever survive again. And if you drew a nice parallel line through that thing there, you'll find out that the Rand slowly went down to just over 15. And then all of a sudden it plummeted again in this last little section here. It's gone down and everyone has imagined that it would stay there. But the reality is it's rebounded enormously. And last night it actually hit 16 Rand 38, which is way less than that little slide. It's gone up again a little bit more. Most of the economists that you speak to in this country will tell you that the Rand is about 30% undervalued. And the reality is that I don't believe that the Rand is going to crash enormously, but it's a delicate game that you play. And if you're the governor of the Reserve Bank and you're looking at numbers like this, you've got to say what makes our mines work, what makes our large industries work. And so for a number roundabout here, it's probably not as painful for us as we think it should be. The one good thing that has happened is that the oil price has dropped enormously. And so almost 30% of our inflation rate is made up of versions or contributions by the fuel rate. And that's going to keep the inflation rate nice and low. And it means that we can play within these numbers. The reality is, though, is that South Africa has very little control over its currency. If Donald Trump gets grumpy with someone in North Korea, the reality is our Rand drops. If he decides to fight with the Chinese, our Rand drops. If an emerging market stumbles, our Rand drops. But the underlying basis and the underlying situation that we have in this country is that we're still fairly economically strong, and our financial institutions are our saving grace. Next slide. So let me ask you which industries you think are going to survive. And these are purely personal opinions. No person can say what's going to happen. We're about to hit the worst of the COVID virus, but I want to make a couple of suggestions here. I run a radio show. It's called The Inspirational Hour. And what happens, I have various business people giving their viewpoints. On Monday night, my show was there with one of the largest hoteliers in the Western Cape. And I said, how do you feel things are going to be in the future? And they said, oh, it's terrible. All my staff have been laid off. There's a huge difference between retrenched and laid off. And I said, what is the difference? And they said, because we have made available the jobs as soon as they become available again. So the infrastructure in the city, especially such as Cape Town, we have a massive tourist infrastructure. The buildings, the restaurants, the equipment doesn't go away. Many of them are already gearing, and tourism, which has been massively hit in the Western Cape, are even saying if it's February or March next year, we are ready within a month's notice to take it back up again. Already, I'm starting to see the specials, not only in Cape Town and not only in South Africa, but I'm starting to even have some global invitations. I just got invited by I like to take cruises. And one of the first things I saw, the QE2 giving us an invitation to come from Cape Town to go through to the United States for less than 60,000 Rand. That is something I've never seen before. I said to her, are you absolutely sure of this? And she said, and I feel the same way. I think that we're going to not see a downturn in travel. I think we're going to see an upturn, and I'd like to call it revenge travel. Because the reality is, as I sit here for 90 days in my house, the reality is, although I've enjoyed it, and I've enjoyed the opportunity to spend time with my family, it has also made me realize how many places I still need to go to, how many things I still need to do. Will that be true for business? I don't think it'll be true for business, but still an enormous opportunity and a great place to come in at a low base and make some good money. Next slide. What a wonderful little poster. This was the June, the 9th of June, I think, the best buyer's market in 35 years, how to make the most of it. So the estate agents were allowed to go back to work last Monday. And one of the things that I did yesterday is I phoned our two biggest agency branches, and I phoned the biggest attorney in the conveyancing office. And I said, how was the first week? And they were absolutely blown away. The property market is absolutely vibrant. A 1 million Rand bond in South Africa cost you 10,000 Rand a month and a half ago. Today it costs you 7,400 Rand. It has created economic opportunities for first-time buyers. It has made many houses affordable. We are going to see lots of pain in the expensive houses, but I think that was to be expected. But the market is moving, and the market is particularly strong. Next slide. Entertainment is changing. The form of entertainment is how we entertain ourselves. Obviously, we haven't been able to go out for a while, and everyone has started using all these electronic things. Many of you know Nick Rabinowitz. He's a very funny comedian in South Africa. Dean and I went to see him. Here's the interesting part. These are some of the industries that are changing, that are creating opportunities. Now Nick, with all the funniness that he has, when we chatted to him afterwards, he said it was an extremely difficult show to give a talk. It's like I'm doing now. I'm speaking to my own face, sitting 12 or 15 inches away, and it's hard to be a comedian. But here's the interesting factor. He sold his show for 50 Rand a ticket. 50 Rand a ticket. You have never seen a show by Nick Rabinowitz for 50 Rand. And so I said to him, was it even worth your while? And he said, Andre, it was okay. And I said, how many people did you have? And he said, no, it was all right. So I said, and I pushed him. And he said, the reality is I had several thousand people. He wouldn't give me exact numbers. But if you got 1,000 people in the show at 50 Rand a ticket, that's 50,000 Rand a show. Nick has never made that kind of money in any show that he's done. If he says several thousand, and let's just pretend it's 100,000. There's 2,000 people in the show. That's 100,000 Rand for a show. So what we're suddenly seeing is that there's a whole change in the entertainment spectrum, which is happening in South Africa. And all of a sudden you can go see the parlor tones for 50. I don't even know what this is in pounds. I don't even know it's money. I think you're probably just going to wave a pound note at it and you probably can go to the show. I also see a little bit of this. I mean, I've enjoyed the Catherine Jenkins shows in Wales and the Andrew Lloyd Webber shows. I think we're going to see a massive change in the way that we spend our money. And it fits in quite nicely with one of our next areas as well. Next slide. Online training in South Africa, you know, we're sitting in a scenario where the majority of the population desperately needs to be geared up in terms of their skill sets. And we have a huge number of our population. For the very first time, I've been sitting here, my daughter, who's 17 years old, has been sitting at home, is able to access training courses of $2,000 and $3,000 and get the skill sets that she needs. Dean and I converted ourselves. I think one of the things, there's only two industries I think that are worse than the travel industry, and that's the events industry, and probably the number one is the speaking industry. The speaking industry means that instantaneously, not only were we found it very difficult, but we were actually outlawed. We can't speak to groups larger than 100 people. But the ability for us to be able to convert and change and do things like speaking to you right now, for us is a phenomena that not many people have had. And it's a privilege for us to be able to take technology, and all this online training is free. In South Africa, our national satellite broadcaster, DSTV, has just made all Udemy courses for free as part of their package. So online training is going to change the face of training in this country. Next slide. Faith Popcorn said it best 25 years ago, the art of good cleaning. One of the things that has happened from lockdown is that we have slowly learned to accept being in our own homes. Now, I know in Johannesburg, that's a slightly different scenario, but in Cape Town, we love to go out and spend lots of time outside. What I have seen is an enormous amount of expenditure that has happened into our homes. We do generally have quite nice homes, and they have become castles. We have the best of fiber, the best of everything. Our kitchens have been upgraded. We don't shop anymore. We do only electronic commerce. That's also an industry. Every single shop, every single hotel has converted itself into e-commerce. Something which has been so slow in the take-up has required a pandemic to change it. And literally in the space of 2 months, every single business has a delivery system, a mechanism of doing the e-commerce, and are changing. The one and only hotel currently, which can't open, is functioning as a fully fledged bottle store. And what happens is the most amazing thing. You can go there, some of the most exclusive wines and whiskeys. You can go there and order them online, and they will deliver them to your house. Next slide. I want to talk a little bit about South Africans, because I know there's a lot of South Africans in the audience and stuff, but I want to teach you a little bit about what kind of people we are. We're a strange bunch. We don't follow the rules. But one of the things we're enthusiastic and we're passionate, and we normally come out the other side quite well. And one of the things that we like to do is we like to very often walk to the edge of the precipice and look down and say no. And over the years, I'll never forget 1994, when we had our first democratic elections. Days before, I said to my wife, there's no possibility that this can go down peacefully. There was all kinds of violence. More than 200 people a day were dying in political violence. And I said, there was no way that we're going to get through this. And for 3 days, we had zero crime, and we had a peaceful election. When I was operating as the managing director of an insurance company, one of the things that I was fascinated by was the statistics that we had from AIDS. Our German parent company said to us there was no ways they were going to invest more money into the country because of the literally millions and millions of orphans that we would have from AIDS. The reality is we did have those millions and millions of orphans. We resolved the problem, and that today is part of the 16 million people that are on social security. As South Africans, we have an incredible resilience to bounce back. And I believe that this is going to be worse than the 1929 depression. I really do believe we're going to see a drop of GDP of more than 10%. I think we've also exposed our Achilles heel, and our Achilles heel is that there are a number of people that are just a few days away from hitting poverty. And when I say poverty, I mean actual hunger. The reality is a lot of people have got jobs, but on weekly jobs and things like that, if you don't have any money for another week or 2 weeks, you're instantaneously in trouble. So I believe that our growth pattern is going to have to be exceptionally fast. And these are 3 things that I think are going to happen. The one is that as an economist, I'm fascinated to hear the people saying things like, we've got to focus on hunger before we focus on growth. That the country may have to support some of the indigent for up to 2 to 3 years. But one of the things that I learned right in the beginning of my entrepreneurial career is that the easiest way to make money is to buy low and sell high. And if I had to say to you today, in terms of South Africa, it's been battered onto its knees. It's been battered onto its knees. But underneath this, there is still a current of huge strength. Our big corporates still have enormous capacity and wealth. And I want to say to you is that if I was going to buy today, if I was going to make an investment, if I was going to buy a business, if I was going to buy a property, and I say to you on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being the worst and 10 being the best, when would you buy? When would you want to buy? And if I had to ask you on a scale of 1 to 10, where are we today as South Africans? And I would say we're probably running at 3 to 4. I believe there is massive opportunity. I've not spent my time today concentrating on the negative. There are more than enough people selling you the negative stories. But the reality is that there are thousands upon tens of thousands upon millions of us as South Africans that are enthusiastic, hardworking, productive, and we know that this is still going to be a good place. So to Sharon and your team from the Chamber, thank you, and it will be lovely to see you back in Cape Town as soon as we're back open up again.
Wonderful to hear from you. It's amazing to listen to an economic presentation and feel at the end of it that there's more than just light at the end of the tunnel. It isn't the train, and that we can look to future opportunities for South Africa. We have got one question that's come through so far, which I'll ask in a second. If I could please have some more questions on the Q&A line, that would be absolutely fantastic from the audience. And then I've got a couple of questions up my sleeve, so gentlemen, please don't worry. There's enough to talk about for the last 12 minutes or so that we've got. This is a fairly long question. This is from Lord Peter Hain from the House of Lords in the UK. His words are, surely it would be disastrous if we repeated after COVID the kind of terrible austerity from which the UK suffered 2010 to 2020. After 1945, when debt per capita GDP was 4 times that in 2010, the UK built millions of homes and created the NHS and the welfare state. And the growth was much higher than the miserable UK level post-2010. So does Dean agree that post-World War II type public investment strategy should drive economies across the world? Dean, over to you.
Wow, I'm going to have to go back to my A-level economics syllabus to answer this one. But no, fantastic question, of course. Well, for me, it is a question of looking at historical trends. Perhaps it is a political question, of course. I mean, we do consider our economics perhaps linked to our political view. So it is a question of looking at macroeconomics. But from a what they call as Lord Hain would know, a Keynesian point of view, and looking at it, it's all about the government stepping in to actually boost an economy. And we saw that happening after the Second World War. So it's a case of spending, taxation, of course, borrowing, but stimulating an economy, as opposed to the other view, which we've seen in recent years in terms of monetarism and austerity. I can only say from my own experience, what I've lived through, I certainly would appreciate government support in terms of boosting economy. I go to my own parents' experience, for example, and perhaps it's this case in society where we think the good old days were better than today. But I've heard it time and time again, how the 50s and 60s were a time of opportunity, where, as I said, people had jobs. There was an absolute boost of economies, of the marketing sector, the industrial sector, manufacturing. So for me, to answer the question without being too specific, I think we need to look at political trends and to see what happened best. I think as politicians often do, they tend to pick the lessons from history that suits their agenda. For me, I think there is no question, if we can look at a period, maybe a decade or so, that follows a recession, a time of real hardship, and see how an economy recovered from a certain stream of economic activity, whether it's, as I said, it's from the Keynesian point of view or monetarism, we can see how it responded. But I do agree. I mean, my politics are certainly aligned to Lord Hain, and I would agree that yes, that I would hope that that's the way it would go. But of course, here in South Africa, we can't just dip into a pot that's limitless. I mean, there are so many things going on. But what I would just pick up on, my part of the presentation was about history. We looked at trends. What Andre is talking about is what is happening now, and really we are still unclear of how this is going, and that will be for historians to write about in the years to come.
Thanks very much, Dean. I don't know, Andre, is there anything you would like to add on that topic before I ask the next question?
Yeah, first of all, I just think it's a huge honor that Lord Peter is here in the first place. I think every South African knows who he is and his enormous contribution. Lord Peter, one of the things that I want to say is that for me as a human being and as a South African has been quite disappointing, is to see that our Achilles heel is so fragile, is that in 25 years of democracy, we've done very little, in fact, to lift up the plight of the majority of people. And I sit here as a privileged white person with multiple domestic servants, and suddenly realizing is that I'm in a scenario where my health system is dependent on the lowest link or the weakest link that I have. And if my domestic servant comes in here in a taxi with 15 people or lives in a poor area, that my health is just at risk. And so I hear the president saying very, very promising words, is that the South Africa that we rebuild will have to be an exceptionally different place. And how that happens, I've got no idea, because we've got actually some capital, but we don't have an enormous amount of capital. But the scenario that we have to do is we have to start looking and saying we have to build from the bottom up. So that obviously means that big companies, we're going to have to pretty much look after ourselves and do those kind of things. But we really have to look at a situation where everything is distributed more equitably. And that, I think, is going to be the challenge, not only in South Africa, but globally. I think we have an opportunity to look at business completely differently. That hotelier that I went and looked at the other day, and I said, is there something you would do differently? And they said, yes. They own 9 major hotels. If I mention the names, you'll know each one of them. And one of the questions they said is that sometimes when we're nice and big and fat, we can use the fat from the other 8 to feed the other 1. Some of the businesses we're going to have to let go. We're not going to do that again into the future. So we're going to have to look and very selectively look and say, where can we build things up? The other interesting thing, as I said to you, I think the first thing we're going to do in the country is going to have to resolve the hunger issues in the next 3 years. For me, as this person, I think productivity is going to be the key, where the industry is far more productive, totally dependent on foreign investment all the time. But thank you, Lord Peter, and a privilege to have the opportunity to.
A question that we've got around, is any view that you both have in terms of the impact of the green on the opportunity to pull itself out of this crisis? Andre, do you want to take that one first?
I'll take a little bit of it. I was very disappointed yesterday to go to a presentation by Ted Blom, who really is our energy expert in South Africa. The reality is nothing that he said was wrong. Everything that he said was technically correct. But the reality is he sounded like a grumpy ex-ExCom employee who was trying to get back at his employer. And I just found that disappointing, because in this scenario, we have to find opportunities in which we can actually make growth. So if I can just use one industry, and that's obviously ESCOM, our power supplier. On Carte Blanche 2 weeks ago, he was interviewed. And I was absolutely fascinated to see a youngish man, 50 years old, standing there and taking the bull by the horn and making rapid difference. Yes, he's had an absolute blessing with the lockdown, and that we didn't use the energy supplies, and he's had some time to actually convert. But one of the first things that he said was the green economy is absolutely critical. And he is standing up there almost man alone and saying many of our future energy suppliers will be the green economy. I don't think we have a choice anymore. I think it has to be part of it. And I'm glad to see that the man's in charge of our energy supply at the moment. He believes the same thing as well.
Andre? Sorry, Dean, anything to complement that?
No, I mean, just to echo, from a social history point of view, I think this is a fundamental time for us to look at our society, look at the way we operate. I'm sure you've heard many presentations and people speak. It's a time to reflect. And I think one of the things we know we were in trouble with was the state of the world and the way people were treating the world. So I think this is a time, for the world to take a breather, but also to see the way we're actually running businesses, and I think looking at the people that are getting coverage now, the ones that are looking forward and actually basing their business activities on the green economy, I think that's fundamental. So it is a chance for us really to draw a line in the sand and almost reinvent ourselves in many respects.
Probably one of the last questions that we're going to have time for, given our time. Yes, probably this is the last one, depending on the length of your answers. We might get another one in. What is the view that you have in terms of travel resuming to South Africa? One side of it is opening the borders. The other one is how are they going to fly planes economically, and to what extent is social distancing going to be managed? And what sort of timeline do you have in this problem area to get the foreigners to you? Because I know there's a lot of people here who want to get out and they want to go on holiday. So your point made, Andre, very, very well understood. And thank you for the QE2 tip. I might follow that one up. And what do you think those timelines are and solutions?
Well, maybe, Dean, that's not really a historical question, so I think I'm going to have to try. It's one of those horrible ones. Well, first of all, we've always got the SAA issue, which is going along there. I think every sensible businessman is saying, please, Lord, let it die. It's been an agony for years. let it eventually go. But the rumor is around the market and everybody in the press is that there's going to be some form of bailout that SAA is going to go here. I don't personally believe that we're going to open our borders for quite a while. And so what is quite a while? So we've heard rumors that we can allow business on our next level, but business, and it's going to be like, and immediately there's the little proviso, it's essential business. So if you're on a critical mission to save Eskom's Medupi project, you're going to be able to fly. So I don't think we're going to see anything by the end of the year. The minister actually said at one stage is that to the tourism industry, and Dean and I have done quite a lot of talks to them, don't expect anything by the end of the year. So I think that's quite a scary statement. But when I look across the world, and I actually have some charts, I haven't got time to show it here, every single airline across the world is in the same boat as what we are. We have to make new decisions. We have to look at new routes. I think one of the saving graces of South Africa is that we're going to have to allow I think the best thing we could do is maybe let SAA die and allow for some more competitors to come in. And the first thing that we need to do is we need to open new routes. But yeah, will that happen? None of the travel people that I've spoken to are looking at anything before February, March next year.
That is a long time away.
It's a very long time, and that's going to take pain. And everybody that I'm hearing about at the moment is targeting all their campaigns towards domestic travel. But listen, when you come here, the skies will be bluer, the penguins will be walking in the street, wild animals will be everywhere, and it'll be the best place you can ever visit.
What I love with my Zoom calls with my South African business contacts and the team that are there in South Africa is listening to the sounds of the Hadidars and the various recognize their calls, and there are the microphones we have these days pick these things up so beautifully. One very last question, very quick answer. What is the role of the private sector in helping generate the opportunities over the next months and year or so?
Again, Dean, if you don't mind, astronomical, I think it's going to be absolutely crucial. I went to a couple of meetings just before the COVID came around, and there were meetings between Rolf Meyer, who many of you will remember was partly responsible for writing our constitution with the president, and Johan van Zyl, who is one of our biggest businessmen, with a private partnership government initiative. And that initiative is still, as far as I know, on the table. And one of the things that I want to say, and they keep turning around and saying, all the businesses are turning around. You go to our massive financial corporates, and they turn around and say, we've got so many hundreds of million, and we'll do this if you do that. And what happens, I think, and once again, and I don't say this lightly, I think in 1994, we were really blessed by having a man stand up who actually could take us through to a new democracy. And I really look around and I say to myself, is there any other human being who in 1994 could potentially have taken us through as safely as he did? And I sometimes feel the same way about Cyril Ramaphosa. I think he has the capacity and the credentials to be able to take us forward. So not only is he a politician, but he has enormous access to the private sector. And for me, it's going to become crucial. And I hope that our private sector doesn't just sit with their hands in their pockets and wait for the government to do everything, because that's an absolute recipe for disaster.
We have got more questions. We have run out of time, which is always sad when that happens. We're going to unfortunately have to close at this point in time. You've given us some amazing insights, gentlemen. It's been fascinating to listen. A whole hour, and I'm wide awake listening and enthralled at every piece of content I've learned. And the one or two bits I would like to just pick up saying, we're a strange bunch. We don't follow the rules. I'd like to add to that, we are resilient. And that, I think, is why we always are able to retrace from the precipice edge that you made reference to. I'd like to thank everyone for attending. It's been wonderful to see so many people in the room with us, some really, really good names of people who have shared time with us this afternoon. But most importantly, if it weren't for the speakers, we won't be in the room together. This is the wonderful thing that COVID has brought, is the ability to reach speakers we could never otherwise have got our hands on and have the opportunity to learn. Andre, you were making reference to the accessibility to information that your children and yourselves are doing. I think we're all benefiting from that, including the chamber. So thanks to our speakers. Thank you very much to Dean. Thank you very much to Andre. This has been fantastic. I think we might pick up on this in a couple of months' time and see where Mr. Big Positive says we're going next. So thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you very much to the participants, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future.
Thank you so
much. Bye.